speaking with Danny Donohue on December the 6th, 2004. Danny, let's begin a little bit, if you would, by having you tell us about your childhood. Where did you grow up? What was your family like? What were your circumstances?
Well, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. I spent about 27 years of my life there. I came from a family of 11 boys and 1 girl. We joked early on that, Dad should have let Mom alone for a while, and the argument was, he argued back, if there would have been night baseball, some of us wouldn't have been there. But truthfully, it was a typical family in Brooklyn when I grew up. There were other families in the neighborhood with 15 children or 10 children. I think all of these people that had come from Europe, and especially from Ireland, and Italy and Germany, were all thinking they were plowing fields somewhere in Brooklyn. You had to have a lot of sons and a lot of daughters. It was a good time. It was the only time in my life I ever understood that one mother can stick her head out a window and holler a name, which there could be 5 Dannys in the neighborhood, and suddenly you knew exactly which mother it was that was calling. It's kind of funny when you think about it that way. Nowadays, kids try to be different, and they all want to look the same. Back then, we all wanted to be the same, and we all looked different somehow. But it was a good neighborhood. I don't remember what money was when I was a kid, because everything was in the book. My father would go around at the end of the week and pay off everything, from barbers to butchers to bakers. I'll never forget the old joke. Summer would come and you'd wind up, you knew it was summer because you stopped going to Catholic school in a uniform, and you got a new pair of sneakers, not Michael Jordans, but like Keds, a couple of pairs of dungarees and a couple of t-shirts. You then got a crew cut. By the time the hair grew in, the sneakers wore out, and the shirts and pants had holes in them, you were back in a uniform going back to school. And that was basically the early time. My mom was a great cook in one respect. Everything went in a pot because you could always add more water and always add more people. My father owned a bar in Brooklyn. I could tap beer before I could spell it. I understood there were 32 ounces in a quart. Even with buybacks, you could do certain things. So it was a rather interesting life growing up.
And with 12 kids, where did you fall in the mix?
I was the 9th son in that process. And I think I was 10 before I even sat down for dinner with my father, because truthfully, there wasn't a table big enough for everybody in the family. A lot of my brothers are a lot older than I am. Some of them look like my father when I was a kid. But it was always interesting.
And kind of being down at the bottom of the pecking order, what kind of lessons did you learn growing up under that circumstance?
Basic union lessons. The first one up was the best fed and the best dressed, and everybody else negotiated for whatever else they could get. You learn to deal with people. You learn to, it's nice to say your brothers and sisters always love each other. Not really. You get those intramural fights that go on. I remember a classic, and it was funny for us, but everybody has their own quirk in their family. You go in and you kick off your shoes, take off your coat, whatever. In our house, you took off your pants. Everybody ran around in their shorts all the time. Well, that worked until my sister came along. Then my mother held a family meeting. And the quote was, "Now listen, you guys, you got to keep your pants on." And one of my brothers said, "Why?" My mom says, "His sister. What's wrong with him? That's the problem with you guys. You don't understand this." But we made Castro convertible famous. Everything in our house converted into a bed, besides the kids. And like I said, some of my brothers, there's a gap of about 8, 9 years between me and a couple of my brothers, older brothers. But besides us, you always had relatives coming over. You always had people staying in the house. I remember being in the basement, shoveling coal into the burner, making sure that you had enough heat and hot water. And seeing a coal bin nowadays is something out of a relic. They think it's the ancient days. My kids think, compact disc players and iPods and cell phones. Didn't you have those when you were a kid? What do you mean black and white movies, or suddenly having to, turn around? You didn't have a McDonald's on every corner? And they delivered things like ice and vegetables and sharpened knives on the street corners. Brooklyn was a different place.
When do you remember first becoming aware of unions? And how did your opinion of unions develop?
My dad had always been a union guy, but I never knew what he had really done in the unions. Unions were always a part of our lives. We were always in a union. You always had to be part of a union, especially in Brooklyn back then. Back then, Brooklyn had 7 newspapers, all in one borough. And it was funny because people would say, well, you live in New York. Well, we lived in Brooklyn. We didn't live in New York. New York was Manhattan across the island. And basically, unions were a way of life in my family, in my neighborhood. Later on, I found out, after my father passed away, that he had actually helped found the Bartenders Union in Brooklyn back some 25 years before he died, 30 years before he died, actually.
Interesting. When did you first become aware of an organization called CSEA?
I was doing what every young man should do in his life. I was bumming around on Long Island after getting out of high school and figuring out whether I wanted to go to college. And what happened was my aunt had said, well, you got to do something. It's getting cold and you can't run around in a bathing suit. So she said, why don't you go to work for the state? So no, truthfully, I said I didn't want to work. She says, then go to work for the state. So I then went to work, and I worked there about month and a half, and I got drafted. When I came back,
You had gone to Central Islip?
Central Islip Psychiatric Center, I was in their orientation program when I got drafted in the Army. And 2 years later, I get out of the Army, and my same aunt says, well, they have to keep your job. You should go and find out about it. Pavlov would be very proud of me. I show up on a Wednesday, and some gentleman cutting the strings out of the inside of a white coat says, well, you start tomorrow. So, and I went to work. I never even enjoyed being unemployed for a while after coming out of the jungle a long time ago. Suddenly it was like, now I'm in this job. And truthfully, I didn't know much about it, working with psychiatric patients. I had never really had orientation. But you start to learn. There were so many good people there. But one day, someone came in and said, listen, you want to buy insurance? And I said, wait a minute, let me get it straight. If I break my arm in a barroom fight in New Jersey, I get paid? Yeah. So, truthfully, he says, okay, fine, I'll take the insurance. He said, well, you got to be a member of the union. And I said, sure. That was never a problem. I was a member of the union. Back then, the dues were 50 cents a month. So it's a totally different world at that point in time.
Had they come to you from the union when you were hired and signed you up?
Not really. From what I understand was in the late 60s, CSEA got collective bargaining. What I mean by that is they got the right to negotiate contracts. Prior to that, it was collective begging. They had no right to negotiate contracts with anyone. So I think CSEA, and this is like 1968, 69, so it was about that time. So I don't think they had done it then. It was still basically working with the insurance operation.
Okay.
Can you hold on a second? And I'm really
So tell me about what your early experiences with the union at Central Islip were like.
Truthfully, it was a different kind of union. I had known unions in the context of working on different jobs where I had to be a member of a union, and there were very rigid meetings, and there were all kinds of problems that were discussed at different times. Back then, CSEA was really, I think, just finding out what it could do. And what it could do was kind of interesting. The first union meeting I ever went to was held in the bottom of a bowling alley on the grounds of CI. They used to have it for the mental patients. And they gave me a can of Ballantine beer and an envelope. In the real old days, water coolers had little like envelopes you pulled out that were waxed in the inside. And it was full of Fleischmann's booze and a can of beer. And there was this Irish guy standing up in front of everybody, Tom Pertell, saying, you want to know what we did at the convention? Well, we got drunk and we tried to get laid. And that was the issue. That was what the union did at that time. Now, I'm not going to lie, I was the ripe old age of about 23, having a great time, meeting young ladies everywhere I could, enjoying life. So union meetings weren't necessarily on the agenda. Ironically, I really got involved in the union at CI after I got married. I remember my wife asking, did I want a night out with the boys? And I said, no, but I'll take one with the girls. And she said no to that. But a friend of mine came to me and said, would I help him become an officer in the union? Or actually president. And I said, sure. He was a nice guy. I didn't understand what the union meant even at that time. So I went on vacation, came back, and I said, well, I'll help you. He says, have you ever thought about running for president? No, and I never had. It was never part of what I was looking at. What he said after that was interesting. He said, well, let's, very honestly, we need to get somebody who can get elected. He had checked the waters, and he couldn't quite do that. CI at the time had 2,700 members. And out of the 2,700 members, they had a rule about attending 12 meetings a year. Out of the 2,700 members, about 20 people were qualified to run for office given that rule.
In other words, if you wanted to run for office, you had to have attended 12 meetings?
Yes, within a year, or you could not run. Other than the incumbent officers and their immediate families, there were very few people who qualified. In the election before I ran, there were actually two candidates. They were 2-year terms then, by the way. There were two candidates, and there were a total of 85 votes cast, total out of 2,700 people. When my friend Mike talked to me about running, we were past the period of time where you could be nominated, so we got petitions signed. We got about 500 names on a petition, and not that people were saying they were in love with me. They were unhappy with the current occupant of the local, the president, and they wanted to change, at least I believe. We then had an election. No, I'm sorry, that's wrong. What happened was after we presented our petitions to the president, he said, well, it's too late to put your name on the ballot. Little did I know, all you got to do is put your name on a little piece of paper in a machine. But he said no. We were then informed by a gentleman named Flannenbaum, who was then the regional president, that no one could stop me from running as a write-in. And to a certain degree, we made history. We got over 500 people to vote in that election for me. As I said before, not because they were in love with me, because they really didn't like the current president, but realistically, they got involved in a union. They took the time to get involved. They literally were standing in a line for hours writing my name on a machine. And it had to be spelled correctly. If it wasn't Donohue, it didn't count. So people took the time to get involved, made a difference. CSEA then, after the election was over, said that they didn't believe it was the right way to do it, that other members should have had a right to run and hold office. We had another election. My opponent in the first election got 250 votes to my 500. The second election, I got 700. He got 250 votes. And I like to joke that since then it's been going downhill ever since. But every election, the members came out, and more members voted in each election.
Now, when you were doing the write-in election, I mean, were you actively campaigning, or was it something that you had kind of done as a lark more than anything else?
Well, actually, I got a little mad when the incumbent president said that I couldn't run, knowing what I did know about the fact that in any union, members have a right to be involved in the election process. And when I got mad, I decided, let me try it. My wife said to me, go do what you're going to do, because she knew she was no point talking to a dumb donkey when it came to that. And yeah, I had to write my name. We did my name on a piece of paper and made about 5,000 copies of the stupid thing and handed it out to everybody so they could write it in the right way. We went to places like our laundry at the grounds of CI, which was very heavily minority workers. People who had never voted in an election on site, or an election at all in some cases. We made a deal with the manager in the laundry that they would be picked up and taken up to vote and brought back to work. and he actually gave him a half hour more to get involved, because he was kind of surprised that people were willing to reach out to the members, to really say to them, come in. Sometimes CSEA becomes like a very close-knit family, doesn't want other people involved. That was a CI that I found then. I also found a lot of people who wanted to be involved. All you had to do is ask them, to get them to understand that it's their union, not mine. They can make it. I love when people talk to me about that. Well, is a write-in that unique? Well, if I would have known then what I know now, I would have never tried it. No one wins a write-in. You win a write-in because people are mad. They're mad enough to get involved. My job then, as president, was to keep them involved, to make them understand they can make a difference.
So what happened when you became local president?
Oh, all hell broke loose. Some of the deals that had been there for years disappeared quickly. We went out and got 52 shop stewards. And we didn't fire any of the old shop stewards. What we said was, we need you. We need you to give us your experience, your knowledge. But things are different. Things are going to change. Some people could cope with that, some people couldn't. Some people at that time, I was, like I said, I think I was at that point in my life about 28 years old, 29. And some people considered me too young to be an officer of a local, let alone the president. So it was a period of adjustment for a lot of the old timers, because things were changing, and it was a period for the younger people to stand up, to get involved in a union. You can only say, I want your help, but if no one comes forward, you lose. So we actively were soliciting people all over the place, night shifts, day shifts.
What year was this, the mid-70s?
I got elected in 1975. I believe it was 75.
So at the same time you're taking on this role, there was also a lot of change happening in CSEA at that time too.
Oh, there was. It was the beginning, I think, of major changes in the union. I didn't know totally about them at the time. Ted Wenzel, who had been the president for a number of years, was on the verge of losing the next election to Bill McGowan, who was from West Seneca in Region 6, who was an electrician. Bill was trying to change the union from an association that Ted Wenzel had every right to be proud of, but since collective bargaining came into place, it had to become a union. We had a responsibility to our members. We had a responsibility to the people that we represented to make it a union.
How did you become an officer of the Long Island region of CSEA?
I'd love to say to you that I planned everything that ever happened. I became an officer by running for first vice president of the region against a gentleman named Jim Corbin.
What year was this?
That would have been in 1978. And Jim was the president of Suffolk County Local, which was a county local of about 5,000 people. And as I said, I was the president of CI, which was about 2,700 members. And we both ran for the position. He was the incumbent, and I beat him. And it was one of those situations where here I was coming from a smaller local than the incumbent officer I was running against, but people again wanted something different. I believe that good people have given me a chance to change the union where I can. And I firmly believe no one gets elected alone. It's good people that get you elected. They have to believe in something. They have to see something in you. And you got to prove you can work for them.
Why did you decide to run?
I decided to run because realistically, I felt that Jim wasn't doing the job. That was my opinion, but it was also the opinion of a number of other officers. That a lot of things that we had hoped to have happen, Jim was young and we would hope that he was standing up and doing the things he needed to, weren't being brought forward. That doesn't mean you fight with the incumbents. That means you give them different ideas. If all you're going to do is say, yes, everything we've been doing over the years is good, then you're not doing your job. You should question what goes on. You don't have to fight and burn down the buildings, but you question it, you look at it. How do we make it better? Because everything can be made better.
So at the time then, in 1978, when you're elected as the first vice president of the Long Island region, the president is a guy named Irving Flaumenbaum. Tell me about Irving.
Irving was a friend, first off. I have to qualify it that way. Irving was the man who called me and said no one can stop you from running as a write-in. Now, Irving did not know who I was. I would love to think Irving knew who I was and thought I was a great guy for the job. He didn't like the incumbent officer in CI either. But Irving was one of those people that once we got to work together, I respected intently. Besides being a bright man, he was a committed man. He was one of those people who took Nassau local, which then represented over 20,000 members, and hand carried dues, or collected dues, I should say, from those members. Built that local into a local of over 20,000 members, not because he was a sweet gentleman, because he was a tough, hard-nosed son of a pup, but he cared about the people he represented.
Now, did he hold the position of region president and local 830 president concurrently?
Yes, he did until about 1979 when that changed. That changed in about 79 where you could only be regional president. You couldn't hold two titles. You could only hold one. And in Irving's case, it was good for the region because Irving basically did care about everybody. It wasn't just his local. And that was helpful to me. It taught me to look at things in a broader perspective. Although I was a state worker, we had predominant local government people and school district people. So you just don't worry about one group, you have to worry about all of them and learn to deal for all of them.
Now, tell me about Irving himself, because I take it he had a rich and lengthy history in CSEA at that time.
Oh, Irving had been the original, besides being regional president, he was the council president back when we had councils. That goes back to the 50s. When CSEA first started, it was basically all state workers. What happened then was the idea in the 1940s, 49 I believe, it allowed local government people to come in. It joined with local governments and CSEA became a lot bigger. At one point we were 350,000 people. Just about every public employee in the state of New York was a CSEA member. Irving started as a local president, a local, I guess you'd call him organizer. Back then we didn't even have a local president, we had chapter presidents. Irving was one of those. And he worked his way up. He was a pharmacist for Nassau County. He helped, as I said, he collected dues by hand. He helped build a stronger operation, bringing people into Nassau County, the towns and villages, besides just the county workers, making it the largest and strongest operation on the island and the largest in the entire state. And like I said, he was at times, everybody had an uncle like Irving. And other times you wouldn't want to meet him in a fist fight because he'd beat your brains out.
But he was, at the time you became first vice president, he was fairly advanced in years.
Oh yeah, Irving had been around. Irving, when I became executive vice president, was about 71 years old. Irving, at that point, was one of our senior people. He had actually run for president against Ted Wenzel at one point and lost. But Irving was probably the dean of the board when it came to that. He was the oldest and probably the most respected person on the board. He had a unique way of doing business at times. You didn't have to ask Irving twice what his opinion was. He'd tell you. Even if you didn't like it, he'd tell you. We had a simple case in the Concord one time when someone questioned whether Irving, as the local president or the regional president, had all of the people from Nassau County that should have been there. There should have been about 250 delegates there from Nassau County. And as you're well aware, we pay for one delegate per 1,000 per locals. And when that happened, there were only about maybe 50 or 60 of them there. And the question was whether he had proxies for everybody. Irving pointed out that if you give him a roll of toilet paper, he'd give you all the proxies you need. It was his way of doing business. It was a different union back then. The tail law was just getting going. Collective bargaining was just happening. We weren't even part of the AFL-CIO at that point. Although Irving was one of the first international vice presidents we had, along with Bill McGowan, our president at the time. Bill beat Ted Wenzel back in the, I think it was like 77. And we had a trial affiliation starting in '78, and Irving and Bill were the first two international vice presidents for CSEA serving on ASME's board.
The contrast must have been quite striking, though, because he was kind of the elder statesman of CSEA, and you were a fairly young man at that time, and I would imagine that you were by no means the heir apparent,
Oh, no.
even though you were first vice president.
The term for first vice president is a euphemism for the guy who, when the president can't be around, they need a body to stand in for him, that's it. Irving ran Region 1. He was in charge. He was the president. Clearly, as the first vice president, I got to work with him a lot. And to be fair, he cared enough to help me become better at what I did, to help me understand local governments better, to help me understand the laws better. Also to make me understand that as a union official, there are very few times when you can say no comment, and there should never be a time when you would mean no comment. You have a position. The position is what your members do. We answer to a higher authority. We answer to our members than most other people do. Politicians come and go, and we're still here. Back then, I remember our 50th anniversary or our 75th anniversary in New York City, and thinking of Irving if he was still there, and Jimmy Lennon and Jack Gallagher and Tom McDonough, all of the people that made the union what it is, all of those retirees that helped build the strength in the union. Irving was probably the best ambassador you can imagine. Here was a 71-year-old man going on 72.
So what then happened to Irving that in the end elevated you to president of the Long Island region?
In September, I believe it was September of 1980, Irving passed away. And he passed away about 9 months before our elections in the region.
Can you tell us the circumstances of his passing?
Yeah, Irving, we had just come off an ASME convention, and Irving was at a local meeting in Nassau County where they were debating issues that had come up at the convention or about the convention. Irving clearly had his own opinions about what the local should or shouldn't do. And the bad part about it, Irving being a pharmacist, I believe Irving also was treating himself. He collapsed at the meeting. Jerry Donohue and Nick Abatello and the other people brought him back. But by the time the ambulances got him to the hospital, he had passed again. And it was difficult. I remember that night in my own life, my wife was on me about, how long you're going to keep playing at this game, because vice presidents of the region were not paid. This was not a career move. This was not, well, how long are you going to go out and enjoy yourself and do this, but your kids need to go to college, you need to move up. I was a truck driver for the state of New York. So we actually had come back from somewhere, and after we put the kids to bed, I had said, well, tomorrow I will talk to my vice president about him taking more responsibility and me trying to do something, because the last thing I'm going to do is take from my family, take from my children's future, my wife. And as I said, this wasn't a paying job at that point. That night, I got a phone call first from Bill Griffin, the regional director, who said maybe I should come in tomorrow because Irving wasn't feeling well. I no sooner hung up the phone than Mike Curtin and Nick Abatello were on the phone saying that Irving had passed away. The next morning, I walked into an office that was blank. Irving had been around for, 25, 30 years. He knew everybody on Long Island, had a picture of everybody staring around at him. That day, that room was absolutely empty, including the nails that held the pictures up. And I suddenly looked around and said, now I'm the president. I had 9 months to an election, and the question was whether or not the members, what they were going to do. He was a longtime leader who was gone. There are a number of longtime leaders with a lot more experience and a lot more knowledge than mine. 9 months later, although 60,000 members could run and 60,000 members could hold office, they elected me. Actually, they elected me unopposed. I'll never forget McGowan asking me how we did that, and I said we had 60,000 people with 60,000 guns at people's heads, and we told them that they can't run, which is, you know, it's a joke. No one, and that what frightened me more than anything was no one literally wanted to be regional president after Irving. No one put their name in, except for me.
But certainly there were people who wanted to be region president.
Egos being what they are, absolutely. I cannot imagine Long Island, which was the biggest region, not having people that wanted to be there. But the only other thing that I really base it on, my personal feeling, is that people were willing to give me a chance. They were willing to give me a chance to see what I could do. They understood that my belief is that you can't just leave things the way they are. You got to change them. You got to make them better. It's not change for change's sake, but you got to look at everything to see what you can do better. And there's nothing you can't do better.
So when you became region president, that was a full-time job, that you were on full-time release doing that job for the union?
Absolutely. In 1969, there was not 1969, 1979, we changed the job to a full-time job with a salary of $30,000. And that was a salary that I was walking into at that point.
Which was probably more than you were making for the state at that time.
It actually doubled what my paycheck was for the state. And that was the more interesting part. For the first time in my life, I was now working for the union and getting paid for it. I thought that would make my wife happier. No, it didn't. You know, when you look at life, you have a tendency, and that was what my wife was saying, you have a tendency to take from people. And when you're working for the union, you don't take from the members, but you steal from your family. You steal in the sense of time and what they would like you to do and how they would like you to handle it. Because people's problems become your family. When someone has a problem, you just can't walk away from them. I'm sorry, I can't talk to you now, set up an appointment. Painfully, that's never been my way, or good or bad, that's never been my way. The crazy part is my wife would argue that one night she left me a grievance form on a kitchen table, and in the side of it, it said, "I knew you'd open this up." So yeah, it was one of those fun times. It was a real transition.
What was the biggest surprise for you when you became region president?
My biggest surprise was that people that had been more or less, as I said, being the executive vice president of the region, had ignored. I could be at a meeting and walk out of the room 19 times, disappear for 2 hours. Nobody cared. They had the president knew what was going on. Suddenly, now I was the expert. The day after Irving died, I had to do testimony in Nassau County on real property tax about what people needed and what they didn't need.
Excuse me, just a second. I think one of our batteries just died.
I know
Oh,
you-
with the position of executive vice president.
Yeah.
You know, basically that people didn't care what I did. They really, you know, I was the executive vice president, but they had the president. Suddenly now you're the president. 2 days after Irving died, I'm doing an issue on real property taxes, and I have to explain, or I have to defend our position to the county legislature, and I'm using Irving's comments. You point at so-and-so, you look at so-and-so, and what I did was I closed it up, and I said, I can't, you have the written commentary in front of you, but let me tell you what it's like being young, being in Nassau County, trying to get a house, trying to live here when everything is so high and so expensive, and not making the kind of money that you'd want to make. And when I got done, I had a real sense I knew what I was talking about. But what frightened me more than anything were the people in front of me absolutely believed I knew what I was talking about. Everyone, you are now the expert. The president was dead, you're the new president. You know everything and everything about it. To the members, even to this day, they come in and they say, they expect you to solve their problems. I go out to visit them to give them a chance to talk to me about their union. I don't think they understand. I get from them something that I don't know if they get from me. I get a sense of why we're here and what we do. I get a sense from them why we're in the union and why the union's important. To a lot of them, it's like, well, the president's here. Well, he's a very busy man and he has all the answers to all my problems. No, I don't. But together we can find the answers to their problems.
Let me just very briefly to kind of wrap up this session. just give me some very brief descriptions about some of the leaders that you've known in CSEA. Did you have much contact with Ted Wenzel?
Not a lot. I was just coming on board as a local president when Wenzel was wrapping up his last 2 years of being president of CSEA. Although I did get to talk to him a number of times, Ted was very involved in what was going on in Long Island, was actually instrumental in helping set up school district locals, breaking them away from the counties and making them self-sufficient. I guess if you're running down the list, you have Bill McGowan, probably one of the nicest men you ever wanted to meet, but one of the most committed men you'd ever see to change this union. He understood that. I love the story of him locking everybody in Chancellor's Hall over there to make sure that no one left until we became part of the American labor movement. And I love all the self-righteous people who have done revisionist history in this organization. The thing I remember was Bill McGowan with that cigar in his face saying, "Nobody leaves." It wasn't a consensus of everybody being in favor. It was his will to make us face the reality we had to face. And that was important. The Irene Carrs.
Tell me about her.
Irene Carr was the first lady of CSEA. She was a woman who pushed the issues that we men sometimes forget about. I'm not talking about women's issues. I'm talking about having programs for children for daycare, for having programs for children for home care. Irene was one of those people who thought family leave, wasn't just a word. It meant men being home taking care of their children as much as women. As a woman's leader, bar none. She believed that women not only have a right but a responsibility. And I think that's the difference. A lot of women leaders will say, well, women should be here and women should be there. Irene said women should earn the right to be here and be there. Women should find the best candidates, regardless of whether they're men or women, and support them and nurture them and mentor them and bring them along. Irene was the first one to say women deserve a chance, but to also point out women have a responsibility to stand up and fight for what they want. No one gave Irene Carr anything. I remember Jack Gallagher, the treasurer, and Irene both fighting at one point. They were both part-time officers, and they wanted to make one of them full-time, and it was like a holy war. Irene demanded to be full-time, and so did Jack. As it worked out, Irene was able to put together enough of a fight so that both of them became full-time officers. And CSEA became a better organization for it.
Obviously, we're going to spend a lot of time on your relationship with Joe McDermott, but just give us a very brief description about Joe.
Joe McDermott was one of those kind of guys that sometimes people forget. He wasn't flamboyant in that sense of it. He was the kind of guy who, like, in using his words for a minute, did the bricks and mortar. He found an organization that after Bill McGowan left, and CSEA to a degree is a cult of personalities. It's like any big organization. When Bill left, there was a vacuum. What are we doing? How are we doing things? Joe knew we had to change, but he did the non-sexy things. He brought on young, bright staff. He brought on people that had a vision. He brought on people that were going to be accountable, people that are going to be around for a while. Some of those people are still here 20 years later. Joe was the kind of guy who, if you needed somebody to stand up for you, he was a rock, a wall. If you needed somebody to be verbose and cordial and kissing necks and running around places, that was not Joe. Joe loved numbers. Joe was the kind of guy who would remind you he was an engineer, not by what his job was, but just by the fact of the way he approached things. He was very analytical. He was very concise. And sometimes that was boring to a lot of people. We're in the business of sound bites and personalities that sometimes go beyond the norm. The more radical, the more crazy, the more independent we seem to think are the brighter, better people. Joe McDermott was a very bright man. Flamboyant and the rest of it, no. But he was at a time when we needed to build those bricks and mortars. You can't build a house without a foundation, and Joe believed that. You want to do the Flanagan piece?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Come back.
But this is a piece you'll add on somewhere.
Okay.
Probably with the Irving stuff. Irving was at a meeting, and the meeting was the argument. They were arguing over whether or not expenses should be paid, whether Irving had gotten expenses from AFSCME, whether he gotten expenses from CSEA, and whether the local should pay him expenses. It was one of those situations where everybody's ego was at a bent, and very honestly, it was also a time when it was the first convention we'd ever gone to. So people weren't quite sure, but clearly there was a question of how many times can you be paid for the same hotel room. And that I think brought about a lot of the pressure on Irving that night. For him to, in Irving's passing, it's sad to say that was the reason that killed him. But by the same token, he was 72 years old, he was medicating himself, and he had also known at the time that the Civil Service Commission, under a gentleman named Bayou, had refused to extend his civil service coverage, which meant he would have to retire. And that was something Irving really never thought he would have to do.